Welcome. This is Jay's Analysis. In this video, we're going to cover the information presented in Soldiers of Reason as compared to the Stanley Kubrick film, Dr. Strangelove. Dr. Strangelove, of course, is a Hollywood presentation of the secrets of the Rand Corporation. And Alex Abea's book is an insider picture, an authorized work on the Rand Corporation. We want to understand its connections to the deep state, how in effect it is the deep state. It is the preeminent think tank of the deep state, along with Brookings Institute, Carnegie Endowment, and many others. But Abea's book is the beginning of, after especially World War II, the Cold War and the rise of dialectics. Rand was an essential establishment organization. It has been at the heart of the interweavings of Pentagon concupiscence and financial rapacity since the time of Eisenhower. In fact, it was Eisenhower who warned of the military-industrial complex, its rise, and of course, who do you think he had in mind? Well, of course, he had in mind the Rand Corporation. Now, if you saw my other video that I did talking about the Pentagon's Brain by Annie Jacobson, you'll know that the information in that book is very similar to the information here. That book is about the history of DARPA. This book is about the history of the Rand Corporation. But the history of Rand and DARPA are intimately intertwined because it's a lot of the same people. And of course, it's a lot of the same interconnects, namely organizations such as the Pentagon, the Air Force, and the CIA. So really, it's just a kind of a revolving door. So don't get too caught up in the distraction or the minutia of wondering which organization was behind what. They're all interlinked. The people who would go to DARPA would be involved in the creation of the Star Wars Defense Initiative at Bohemian Grove, and they would be directly from the Rand Corporation. So they're all connected. The reason that Rand is important, though, is because Rand was important in shifting our culture from a production society to a consumerist society. Rand was important in terms of formulating ideas like Obamacare, of selling ideas like the Desert Storm as something that would be a 24-hour reality TV presentation. The Rand Corporation is an example of a creation of the military-industrial complex, or the Pentagon in terms of the Air Force. It arises from the Air Force, General Curtis LeMay and others. And it is, in fact, the institution that gave us the welfare state. In fact, yes, the welfare state, the war on poverty are ideas that come out of the Rand Corporation, not to mention the Persian Gulf War, Operation Iraqi Freedom. All of these, according to Abea, come out of this institution. But most notably, the reason we want to talk about Rand is because of the critique that you've heard me give for several years now about libertarian atomistic individualism. This cult of the individual is absolutely necessary to Rand's conception of consumerism and the creation of identities that are bought and sold. This individualism, this atomistic individualism from the time of Adam Smith all the way up through Ayn Rand and others, would be the driving force and ideology behind the quantification theories of the Rand Corporation. In fact, Abea makes no bones about openly saying the Rand Corporation is behind self-interest and rational choice theory. They're behind the cult of the individual. The rational choice theory of the cult of the individual is, in a way, cultural death. Now, this is interesting because we often have it presented as if this is the soldiers of reason, we could say, are set over against the Cold War Soviets, right? The demagogues, the tyrants of the atheistic empire. But wait a minute. It's actually the denizens of the Rand Corporation that are also neoconservative atheists. They're the fathers of neoconservatism. Herman Kahn, Wolfstetter, Brody, and others. Irving Kristol. They're all from the Trotskyite neoconservative camp, or what would become neoconservatism. Now, I want to mention dialectics because the Soviet Empire was also an empire of reason. The only difference is that the Soviet Empire, equally as atheistic as the Rand Corporation's individualistic empire, was also based on the cult of materialism, historical materialism and dialectical materialism. Right? The modes and means of production, the class warfare of communism, set over against the Western idea of the sovereign individual. Both of these are dialectics. Do you want the one, or do you want the many? Or do you want them both in tension? And this is precisely where we get the idea of the need to create intercontinental ballistic missiles for a global war. And the global war on communism will give rise eventually to the global war on terrorism. You've heard me say that for many, many years covering the Bond series, and that's in fact what Abea says. Now, RAND was like NASA originally under the Air Force purview. It is an institution dedicated to scientific government, to technocracy, in other words. Its founder, General Curtis LeMay, one of its founders, I should say, coordinated efforts to fight the Japanese by allying with Mao Zedong. And just like you've heard me cover with Bill Donovan, the founder of the OSS, it's Bill Donovan who trained Mao's guerrillas. The Maoist revolution was propped up by the CIA. And this is even admitted here in Abea's book, with Curtis LeMay also partaking in that dialectical venture. RAND Corporation is, of course, behind the art of war and operational research. The attack on the Japanese civilian cities was designed by the RAND Corporation. The idea of the quantification of all life into mathematical formulas by which we could calculate rational ethical decisions, rational choice theory, game theory, these are also elements of RAND. The idea of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the idea of Project Paperclip, the idea of satellites, satellite warfare, the idea of an interconnected technocratic AI Skynet grid, these all come out of RAND. It is, in fact, Robert McNamara and William von Neumann, who we covered in the DARPA book, that are behind the ideas of a completely drone global brain AI system to run the planet. Knowledge of the human psyche would be central to the psychological warfare operations of the Cold War and RAND, and the ability to use the bomb almighty, the cult of the bomb. If you've seen Planet of the Apes 2, the bomb biggity baby, the cult of the bomb, all tied into what's called the Gaither Report, which we covered in the DARPA book as well, which was a bunch of contractors, Bell Telephone, Boeing Aircraft, all working together with the Air Force and RAND to come up with profitable means to scare the living daylights out of Americans so that they could bank on the Cold War. Now, the Cold War wasn't just about money. It was also for this purpose of erecting a global government, setting the stage for the next phases of the global government to come by erecting the technocracy, but also to set up an international surveillance system. A big part of this would be the many Hollywood actors, John Ford, Frank Capra, and many other from the Hollywood 10, Hollywood scene, who would contribute to the idea that the commies were everywhere in the American government. Right, running out of Moscow, and it was up to the neoconservatives at RAND to stop this international threat of communism, who are more or less terrorists, right? RAND would study social science, they would study economics, in all areas of life to come with a rational mathematical quantification theory by which you could predict everyone's movements. They would work with the OSS and leftist academics. And of course, if you remember, this is where the OSS comes into play with the Frankfurt School, bringing the Frankfurt School Marxists to the U.S. So guess what? It wasn't Moscow sending Marxists to infiltrate the U.S. It was the U.S. itself bringing the Marxists. Many of these individuals would in fact be given scholarships. Some would become Rhodes Scholars. One of the premier Randians, Mr. Hitch, would be a Rhodes Scholar, part of the Oxford Network, the Cliveden Set type group that we talked about in the Quigley lectures. And the purpose of this group would be to quantify everything. They were in fact called quants. Right? Everything is math. Everything is formulas and technocracy. The presuppositions, according to Abea, of RAND are atheism and materialism. The assumption is that there is scientific neutrality, but there's not, right? There's no neutrality when the key organizers of this national defense superstructure are all of the Fortune 100. There's no neutrality when the technocratic presuppositions of the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and many other globalist institutions are the ones designing the policy of the American government. As we can clearly see, the full spectrum dominance that he mentions, yes, he mentions on pages 34 and 35, this massive full spectrum dominance are at the behest, not of a government organization known as the Air Force, the Pentagon, but of the Fortune 100. Technocracy is a tool of corporatism. During the Cold War, George Kennan would come up with the conception of containment. Paul Nitze would be involved in the ideas of formulating the Rand Corporation's atomic policy almost single-handedly. And others like LeMay and Kohlbaum would be instrumental in the implementation of National Security Council Memorandum 68, which would, of course, be about the nuclear preemptive strike capabilities. The new global threat that arose in the Cold War was communism, and a global threat requires a global police force. Right? This global threat would only for a few decades be the communist threat before we would come to the point of needing a global government, right, to police the new threat of terrorism. If you remember the other talks that we did and the talks that I've done on atmospheric engineering, then you know that Edward Teller, also instrumental in the founding of DARPA, was very closely connected to RAND. The Office of Naval Intelligence, Naval Research, all these are also intimately interlinked. And you have Bertrand Russell, Brody, and the New World Order essentially speaking of the need for global government because of nukes. So did you get that? Because nukes were invented, we now have to have global government. And because nukes are supposedly everywhere now, proliferated across the world, we now need to have a complete drone system active over the United States. Something out of Shape of Things to Come. If you've seen H.G. Wells' movie, this is what they do. The Masonic Air Force erects a global air force to enforce global government. Yes, H.G. Wells predicted that back in the 1920s and 30s. The Marxists, however, as we saw with Jacobson's book, didn't actually possess all of the nukes that the Gaither report and the National Security Council claimed that they did. In fact, this was wildly exaggerated precisely for the purpose of giving an excuse to create DARPA and the RAND Corporation. The guiding philosophy, as we said, was naturalistic determinism and strict game theory. Marxist dialectics had to be combated with capitalist dialectics. And what we get here is, again, the rise of technocracy, the rise of DARPA, a Hobbesian materialistic view of the Leviathan state, all premised on Adam Smith's laissez-faire selfishness doctrine. The idea is that if you look at classic problems like the prisoner's dilemma, what you get is that all actors will be completely self-interested. And one way to ensure that all actors in any conflict, game, challenge, match, battle, or whatever, is to actually promote radical doctrines of selfishness. That's right, the Ayn Rand philosophy. Eventually, Rand would develop systems analysis that would perfect the science of war. Nukes would play into this hugely, not even so much in terms of actual bombs going off, but rather the nukes as a psychological warfare tool. As the boomers were all taught with their tiki bars in their shelters, right? Build a tiki bar in your nuke shelter. Jump under your desk when the bomb goes off. Of course, jumping under a desk, stop, dropping, and rolling when a supposed nuke blast is going off is not going to do much good.
An attack could come without warning. The sky would suddenly light up. If a doorway is right at hand, use it. If the nearest shelter is more than a couple of steps away, fall to the ground immediately. Flying glass and debris are immediate dangers, so stay where you are until you're sure it's safe to move. If you are at home when a surprise attack occurs, crawl beneath a table if it is very near, or drop to the floor with your back to the window.
But it does work masterfully for scaring the living daylights out of everyone, including school children. As we said, Abea covers the fact that all the original neocons and Randians were out of the worldview of Trotskyism. But this was all the better because they had mastered the tactics of terror. Leninists and Trotskyists were, of course, proponents of using terror to wage war against the existing government in Russia, the Tsar. And what this new narrative of the danger of the destruction of the world through nukes did was prepare the world for a new savior, right? America, the United Nations, would come to be the saviors of the world by policing this supposed nuke threat. Nukes, atomic theory, it's all going to come to an end if we don't have somebody to police this. Meanwhile, the lunatics at the Rand Corporation were laughing about wargasms. I'm not kidding, that's what they called it. The thrill that they would get from the terror and panic induced upon the low IQ public. And this would be individuals like John Nash, Edward Teller, Herman Kahn, Wolfstetter, Brody, and others. So essentially, you're run by these technocratic, autistic dorks. That's who's running the whole system in terms of the brain perspective, right? There's the brains and there's the money. Money power is big banking and Fortune 100, and the brains are these clowns. And guess what? This is exactly what's lampooned in Dr. Strangelove. Now, Dr. Strangelove, of course, is also in a way a version of propaganda, but in many ways it is also revelatory because Kubrick shows the idea of, they're going to put fluoride in the drinking water. Now, this is lampooned in the idea, in the mindset of the general, but actually this was going on. And it wasn't commies putting fluoride in the drinking water. It was the military-industrial complex that made the decision to put fluoride in the drinking water. The military-industrial complex was successful in the Cold War by creating a gigantic global excuse for setting up a technocracy that would be far more dangerous than any so-called classical Marxists, most of whom didn't even exist or have a real contingent, right, after the 1900s. Now, you had Eastern Bloc communism, Sovietism, which was different. But of course, Eastern Bloc Sovietism was propped up by the West. If you've read Anthony Sutton, or if you've looked at the research of Carroll Quigley, right? And despite the road bump of Stalin and not accepting the Marshall Plan, for the most part, the system of atheistic communism was lauded and praised by the same globalists in the West who wanted to defend capitalism. In fact, you've heard me cover Bertrand Russell's books, where Bertrand Russell says that he cannot wait to see what the Bolshevik and Stalinist experiments are able to produce as a social experiment in Russia. The wars also had the effect, the Cold War also had the effect of planning out continuity of government operations so that rationing and total cultural control could be enacted under the guise of whatever threat the government said existed. And yes, if the nukes went off, we might have toxic Avengers running around, and we might have three-tittied women bouncing around like Total Recall. But it would all be worth it if we could preserve the race through a breakaway civilization. I'm not joking. This is literally what the Randians spoke of And although in the time of Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, he lampoons this by saying that the military-industrial complex elites might prefer to have 10 brides of their own to repopulate the earth. Nowadays, I don't think that would even be the case. It would be something more insidious, like would it be child brides? Would it be? I don't know, but it wouldn't be heterosexual. I don't think anymore. We're far beyond that period. So the nuke age itself, we can intimate, was largely a psychological operation concocted at rand. That's what's so amazing here. Stop, drop, and roll? Really? Underneath a desk when a nuke is coming? This is like the 50 million people that watched the TV movie The Day After, right? Which scared the living daylights out of all Americans, thinking that at any moment a nuke was going to go off, and you better have a bunker, right? And by the way, these characters are the ones who promoted the idea of selling bunkers to everybody. And on top of that, we cannot forget Hollywood. Hollywood was instrumental. He notes H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, that all of these ideas contributed to the possibility of a global scale apocalyptic destruction that was coming. And in order to save everybody from this global apocalypse, the space race was necessary. The Gaither Report came up with this idea, and again, that is the everybody from MIT, Shell Oil, John McCloy, the CFR, the World Bank, Chase Manhattan, Westinghouse, Rand Corporation, Sprague Electric, on and on and on. The CIA, Andrew Marshall, the father of mechanized drone armies. Right? That's what's coming. That was designed by Andrew Marshall. The dronification of the entire Air Force. Alan Dulles played into this by the fact that this would lead to the global war on terror, right? Because the commies were instrumental in being classified as the terrorists. Now, again, these are a lot of neocons who were themselves former commies, supposedly, right? But former commie and present-day neocon really don't mean anything, do they? Because in global politics, those are just titles for power blocks. And the ideologies don't mean that much, right, to raw power. And it's in fact the Rand Corporation, as he ends this first section of the book, that would lead to the Star Wars Defense Initiative, right? And we've covered this in many talks. I've covered it in at least 3 or 4 different talks and public lectures, by the way. Star Wars Defense Initiative would be crucial in the erection of the coming global technocratic Skynet. So that is the introductory section to my analysis and my take on the book, comparing it with Annie Jacobson's works, the other globalist books that we read, comparing it with the presentation in Dr. Strangelove, the film. And I've got a whole lot more analysis to give you if you go to Jay's Analysis and subscribe at the PayPal links, and you'll get the rest of this analysis in the next few days when I complete it. Thank you for watching this. Be sure to like and subscribe below. And if you go to Jay's Analysis in the shop, you can buy my books, which are basically print versions of the kind of talks and material that you're hearing in this video. Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols 1 and 2. Excellent reading material if you're more of a reader than a video watcher. And I also offer signed copies. So subscribe to the channel, like and share if you enjoy, and let me know what you think in the comments. Leave me a comment below. Tell me if I missed something, if you think I could improve this in any way, or if you just liked it in general. Thank you for listening and watching. If you like this analysis, be sure to click subscribe and give me a thumbs up down below. Also, be sure to check out Jay's Analysis and definitely click the bell down below to be sure you get the updates.